Hello and welcome. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching a special broadcast here on DD India. The coronavirus pandemic has plunged the world into a crisis. Thousands of people have died worldwide, including in South Asia. Governments are scrambling to contain the spread of coronavirus. There is no vaccine available yet against this virus. What's the economic impact of coronavirus on the world economy? Will governments set aside their politics and join hands in the fight against coronavirus? Can diplomacy help? Now, 4 months into the coronavirus outbreak, we are struggling for answers. We know what the problems are, but the world desperately needs solutions. So we thought we'll focus at the intersection of politics, economics and diplomacy so that you, the viewer, know what it takes to be on top of the news. Two guests join me in the studio to help break it down for you. Let me introduce them to you. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Chairperson of RIS and a former Indian ambassador to France, and Professor Rakesh Joshi, Chairperson of IIFT. Let's get started. But first, I want to bring you up to date on the news so far. Coronavirus is spreading rapidly. It's forcing governments to impose restrictions rarely seen outside wartime. Closing borders, ordering home quarantine, and scrapping public events, including major sporting fixtures. Now, Italy, the hardest hit nation in Europe, announced another surge in deaths. The second most affected country outside China is Iran. Now, some Iranian officials have died. Some cabinet ministers, lawmakers and military officers have caught the virus as well. Now, Spain also announced that it would seal off its land borders. Spain has officially become the third most infected country outside China, surpassing South Korea as its arc of contagion curved higher. While in France, over half of the country's coronavirus patients in intensive care are under the age of 60. The country is the fourth worst hit in Europe. Now, in China, the disease is on the decline, indicating that the course of the outbreak there has been altered. Now, social distancing is the new catchphrase. The Indian government has told states to shut schools, gymnasia and cinemas. It's encouraged private companies to let its employees work from home where feasible in an effort to reduce the possibility of spreading coronavirus infection within the community.
Social distancing measures as a preventive strategy has been proposed for implementation. These interventions are proposed to be enforced till 31st of March 2020. Closure of all educational institutions, schools, universities, etc., gyms, museums, cultural and social centers, swimming pools and theatres. In public transport, besides ensuring regular and proper disinfection of surfaces. Encourage private sector organizations, employers, to allow employees to work from home wherever feasible.
Now, Prime Minister Modi has asked people to share technology-driven solutions for coronavirus. In a tweet, he said that a lot of people have been sharing technology-driven solutions for COVID-19. He urged them to share it on citizen engagement platform MyGov India, saying the efforts can help many. He said that innovation should be harnessed for a healthier planet. Meanwhile, the coronavirus outbreak has spooked some world markets. US President Donald Trump said that he was focused on addressing the health crisis and that the economy would get better once that was in line. He said that the worst of the virus could be over by July, August, or even later. He called it an invisible enemy.
Well, it may be. We're not thinking in terms of recession. We're thinking in terms of the virus. Once we stop, I think there's a tremendous pent-up demand, both in terms of the stock market and in terms of the economy. And once this goes away, once it goes through and we're done with it, I think you're going to see a tremendous surge.
Meanwhile, in a major development, the first human trial to evaluate a candidate vaccine against coronavirus disease has begun in Seattle, in the U.S.
I'm also pleased to report today that a vaccine candidate has begun the phase 1 clinical trial. This is one of the fastest vaccine development launches in history, not even close. We're also racing to develop antiviral therapies and other treatments, and we've had some promising results, early results, but promising, to reduce the severity and the duration of the symptoms. And I have to say that our government is prepared to do whatever it takes. Whatever it takes, we're doing. We're doing it in every way.
And across the Atlantic in Europe, European Council President Charles Michel has called for another EU summit on coronavirus response through video conference. The EU 27 leaders held a virtual summit last week, during which they called for a coordinated response orchestrated by the European Commission, member states and the European Central Bank. All right, let me bring in my guests for a discussion on COVID-19 diplomacy, economics and politics behind it all. Ambassador Mohan Kumar and Professor Joshi, if I can start with you, Ambassador Kumar. Your take on the diplomatic efforts undertaken by India and the world at large to contain and combat COVID-19.
So thank you very much for having me on the show. I think without diplomacy, it's almost impossible to really tackle and confront this crisis jointly. So even countries like US and China, or China and Taiwan for that matter, countries which may otherwise have an adversarial relationship in normal times, are forced to share their experiences. So in a way, diplomacy gets a boost, if you like, not because it is the preferred course of action, because it is almost the necessary course of action. More importantly, I think countries also tend to think that there is no way this issue can be beaten without multilateral cooperation. In that sense, I also find multilateral diplomacy getting a boost. We talked of areas where multilateralism was on the decline before the coronavirus. I think this issue has brought back multilateralism in sharp relief, because issues like coronavirus, cybersecurity, terrorism, etc., simply cannot be handled without multilateral cooperation. So I do believe diplomacy will have an extremely important role to play. Just the evacuation of nationals from China, from Iran, from other countries, which I think you would have to say, even the worst critic of the government of India has to say that the Indian government has done wonderfully well to evacuate the Indian nationals who were there in some of these crisis-ridden countries. And even that calls for very deft diplomacy, because we not only evacuated our nationals, we made an offer to South Asia that other country nationals, Maldives and Bangladesh and Sri Lankan nationals, have been evacuated by us. So I can go on and on, but you get the drift of what I'm saying. I think it's brought diplomacy and multilateral cooperation back center stage, in my view.
Indeed. Professor Joshi, Ambassador Kumar dealt with the diplomatic aspect of the coronavirus, the efforts to contain it. If I were to ask you to help our viewers understand the economic impact of coronavirus on the Indian economy and the world economy at large.
You know, I've got a very different point to say what Ambassador Kumar has said, because I think it is basically the integration of value chains and the global value chains, global network, which has created havoc in the entire system now across the world. Now multilateralism, I'll come later. If you see now, the China account for 20% share in the global value chain, and from 2002 the China's share in the value chain was 4%. Now it has come to 20%. Everything, even India is one of the largest exporter of the generic medicines, but for raw material, for a lot of things we are dependent on China. So it is not only India. China is the largest supplier of mask which is required now. 50% of the world mask comes from China. China, getting out of the whole thing because of this problem. So entire world economic system is absolutely disrupted, and people are finding it difficult to find the solution. Now India. So two things. China is the largest exporter in the world with 13% share. Last year it was 14%, 14% share in the world market. More importantly, the China also manufactures and supplies a lot of manufactured goods. So the entire value system has come to. Now I think it's a time for cooperation, not conflict. But when you come to multilateral conflict, we are talking of the, you have seen soon before the, coronavirus issue, there was a big fight between US and China, which we are discussing for last 2 years, is the US-China trade war. Now the whole European Union came basically to integrate the European Union. But in English there is a big saying that I think we should remember right now: a friend in need is a friend indeed. Indeed. And Italy is probably the worst impacted country. Last 2 days it is having more than 350, 360 deaths of coronavirus. Now when Italy requires the medical assistance, the members of the European Union are reluctant to give them the medical assistance. So this is the whole concept. Even 2 days before, the president of the European Union and the Euro Bank, they have said that Italy's currency and the euro integration, those questions are being raised. So I am very skeptical about the kind of the cooperation which is, and ultimately then it comes that there is no shortcut to the self-sufficiency of any of the countries. You have to ride over these things, and in this, fortunately, probably India is not as integrated as China is, and therefore our impact is going to be much lower than the impact going to be on China is on the entire system.
Indeed. Point well taken, Professor Joshi. Ambassador Kumar, Prime Minister Modi has taken the initiative to convene a video conference of all SAARC member countries. He's also reached out to the G20, saying the G20 might be the appropriate global fora to take up efforts, to have joint efforts to combat and contain coronavirus. So in that context, given that multilateralism is gaining currency in the context of COVID-19 efforts, what role do you see for organizations such as SAARC, G20, or even SCO for that matter, to learn from the best practices and experiences of various countries?
So I'll begin with the SAARC,
sure,
if you will, because this is an organization that was practically written off. It was moribund, and I'm putting it as mildly as I can, and so on. But I think the fact that Prime Minister Modi has chosen to use this forum is very, very interesting from an ex-diplomat's point of view, from my perspective. I mean, he could have used several other fora. There was BIMSTEC, there were so many other things that he could have done. But I think the fact that he highlighted South Asia as one geographical entity, I think it sends a message that no matter what your differences, and we know there are significant differences among South Asian countries, not just India, Pakistan, but other countries as well. I think he used the SAARC to say that maybe this is the forum to deal with issues like the coronavirus or the COVID-19. And I think this will take us back to the good old times when South Asia was really integrated and it was a geographical entity unified in itself. The issue about G20 is slightly different, and I think it speaks to the enormous clout that the G20 now has. Whichever way you look at it, economically, population-wise, just geopolitical clout, it is G20 today, not the UN Security Council. So if you want to talk about global problems and devising global solutions, so whether it's terrorism, the Financial Action Task Force, the Osaka track of the cybersecurity, I think G20 is almost an automatic choice. So I'm not at all surprised there that the Prime Minister spoke about G20. And I think I would say that in a very soft sort of way, multilateral fora will get a new lease of life. This is at least my view. And my view is that I'm convinced no matter how much integrated you are not, the fact of the matter is India has such a long border with China. We have a long border with Myanmar. We have a long border with Bangladesh. And we, of course, have a border with Pakistan. I simply don't see how India can become an island. I'm not even mentioning the open border with Nepal, by the way. So we really can't afford to think that, we can get through this just on our own. So I think you need to think of ways in which you can use different multilateral fora. And by the way, we're just seeing the beginning of it. So SAARC and G20 are automatic choices maybe. There will be other fora which may come in handy. where I think the countries can get together and devise ways. If nothing else, I would strongly argue that we must look at how countries like China, South Korea, Japan, Singapore have dealt with this.
Right.
Because we seem to be going through a phase which those countries went through a month ago. So we are actually fortunate that we've got a bit of lead time and that we can actually look to these countries about how they did. I mean, you've heard this theory from physicians that the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 and stage 4, it seems to be a matter of consensus that India is in stage 2. So before local transmission becomes community transmission,
Right.
I think we really have a lot of best practices to gain from countries like South Korea, Japan and China.
Indeed. Professor Joshi, let's talk a bit, if you will, and focus on the economic costs and consequences of the coronavirus outbreak. There are reports about fears of airlines going bust in the next few months. There is talk about the Chinese industrial output dropping for the first time in many, many years. There are fears of the impact on the service industry, tourism industry. What are the fears, pitfalls of dealing with a crisis of this magnitude for countries such as India?
I think the most important driving force during this crisis is going to be the fear rather than any other thing.
I see.
Now, something which is driving the slump in the economy is probably the fear psychosis among the people. Now, fear, one is the real fear, one is the perceived fear. And for the perceived fear, what is very important is, let's not sensationalize the entire issue. And that way, I'm very sure what government is doing is, we need to be prepared. We need to be prepared. There is no shortcut to our preparedness and everything. But the fear psychosis we need to contain, and not only we, but in the entire world. You have seen a few days before in Australia, or a toilet paper, there was a fight and somebody was murdered. Across the world, people are fighting and crimes have increased just to get shortages and more of the fear psychosis. Now the people have started hoarding the things, not only India but across the world, in view of the fear psychosis. Not the shortage today, but shortage tomorrow.
Right.
And I think many channels and news and everybody is saying that you hoard the food, you hoard the sanitizers, you hoard the medicines, and hoarding in the personal capacity, and the B is hoarding by the retailers and the wholesalers who has to make more profit. So I think this not only we can enter into a vicious cycle that I think we need to look into. When it comes to preparedness, I think two things. One, I think so far so good. The government of India has done wonderfully well, because I think we have done only 130, 132 cases at the most, and we have done much better. Even I don't want to be claim as our success, but I think God is also with us, because the Prime Minister Modi has shown a big courage to bring so many of the Indians from Iran, Milan, China, where our neighbor has not done. But I think the number of cases in our neighbor has increased much more than India. So I think God is certainly with us, and God will always be with us. So this way, I think the preparedness and the way we have done the isolation. But when it comes to the economy, because when you struggle, all economic activities, which include the transport, travel, advisories, which says close the schools, public places, shopping malls. So slump is already there. And slump is going to be much more than I think what the economic forecast you see. And nobody is sure of when it is going to end. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 quarter, 2 quarter, or a full year. So in case it ends maybe 3 or 4 months in 1 quarter, the economic slump would be great, but I think we'll come back. But God forbid that, like the Spanish flu in 1918-19, it goes for one full year, then I think it would be devastating, not only for India but for the entire entire human, you know, the
Right.
human humanization.
Indeed.
At the most.
Indeed. Indeed.
And that I think we need to we need to look into.
Sure.
And with that, two things: the preparedness, the precaution,
Right.
and we are talking of isolation. But I think there is a different scientific theory. In Britain, what they have said is, the British scientist has said is that in case you allow the people to have more infection, what they call is the herd infection, then the people will have immunity, and the pandemic will die automatically.
Sure.
So that is one school of thought which except for Britain nobody is
Right.
following.
Right.
But because of this isolation, when the people don't develop immunity, it may come. So
Sure.
anyway, it is to be debated scientifically,
Sure.
but we do not know. And ultimately, you know, we need to believe, the God.
Right. Ambassador Kumar, let's focus a bit, if you will, on the politics behind this coronavirus outbreak. Let's refer to the case of the diplomatic row between China and the US. There are trading charges saying the other is responsible for this crisis. We've seen the Americans summon the Chinese ambassador to the US after reports suggested that America may have had a hand in the outbreak of the coronavirus. And the second report is a more recent one in which there are reports which have since been denied, but they are still circulating in the media, that Americans wanted to lean on a German company which is in the process of coming out with a vaccine, and they wanted this vaccine only for exclusive use of the Americans. So what do you make of this, the politics creeping into what is essentially humanitarian crisis at the end of it all?
So I think first the politics of it, and the second one I would describe it more as an issue of intellectual property rights.
Right.
So as far as the politics of the issue is concerned, I think it would be unfortunate if there was an equivalence between the claims made that the disease had its origins in China, and you established an equivalence with the claim that it originated in the US. I mean, I think that there has got to be some scientific evidence, and I think there is enormous evidence pointing to how it originated in China.
Right.
Now, we will wait for detailed results to come in as to how this began in a wet market, the kind of wildlife, animal food that is consumed, etc. But there is almost unanimity that the first 2 months, the Chinese have not exactly been transparent, and I'm putting it as mildly as possible. I mean, there is little doubt that once the problem burst into the open, the Chinese did everything in their power to confront the issue, and their political system allows them to take measures of an extreme nature, which perhaps may not work in several other societies, including our own, frankly. But there is little doubt that the Chinese, once the issue broke out into the open, were able to take drastic measures. But we are talking about the time before that, when I think there was a certain lack of transparency, a certain lack of willingness to admit that this was a big issue. And so that remains to be seen. I wouldn't go as far as to accuse anybody of anything, but I think this is an issue that needs further examination and further scrutiny. On the other issue of the German company and so on, I would say that my interpretation of intellectual property rights is that if there was to be a vaccine tomorrow, even the basic laws of intellectual property would accept the present situation as a public health emergency.
Right.
And in public health emergencies, it is understood that countries can actually suspend intellectual property rights and resort to compulsory licensing. And this is well accepted in intellectual property law. Even if you had a patent right for a particular medicine, if you had a public emergency situation, the governments are allowed to kind of say that, listen, this is a time where we will put public health considerations ahead of other things. So I would be very surprised if even if an American country or an American company, or American government were to acquire this vaccine, it would be unfortunate if that was only used for Americans and not for the world at large. So I'm fairly confident that this pandemic, which has been declared as a pandemic by WHO, qualifies as a public health emergency in any intellectual property law. So governments have the authority, the broad authority, to take measures to protect public health.
Indeed, I'm running out of time. So one last question to you, Professor Joshi, very quickly. Would you agree with this submission that this crisis also requires a behavioral change on the part of people around the world? In terms of communication, in terms of opting for a video conference rather than a physical meeting at a specific location, or even reducing air miles, air travel for that matter?
No, I fully agree. I think the behavior change is certainly required, and if you see, I think it's a time. It's a time for cooperation for each one of us. Like you were discussing about the intellectual property rights. I am very sure that you know about it. How greedy the multinational companies are. How protective is the US is in protecting the intellectual property. How possessive even the entire European Union is. But the last thing which I come is, I think which the entire world need to know, that it's a threatening situation for the entire humanity, for the entire human civilization, and they should take a lesson from one Veda mantra which I will like to say: Om Sehna Vavatu Sehno Bhunattu Sehviryam Karva Vahe Tejasvina Madhita Vastu Mavi Dvishavahe. We should live together, our intellect should increase together, and if our intellect increase together, we should not have conflict, but we should cooperate for betterment of the entire humanity. And this is the lesson the entire world need to take from India.
Absolutely. On that note, Professor Rakesh Mohan Joshi and Ambassador Mohan Kumar, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. And that's a wrap on this special broadcast. But news continues here on DD India. You can catch all the latest updates on our social media, mobile and digital platforms. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.